although I think he's with my brother right now.
A whole 15 minutes, huh? And if you could post that link, and I'll just.
Still don't like that this book is literally falling apart.
Oh, the Miller.
Yeah, 'cause it's Doctrine of Being.
Yeah. Well, soon it will not be anything. Okay. I'm full of them tonight.
All right, so it's shared. And now 2 spots. All right, so it's
Okay, great. So I will lead off pretty much without further ado, since we only have an hour and there's a little bit to cover, actually less to cover than last time, but that's okay. I just want to give everyone a chance to speak if they have anything. So great. Good evening, comrades. Tonight we're going to talk about the beginning of Hegel's Science of Logic. Can everybody hear me? Okay. I'll be leading off tonight. If you have any comments or questions, place your type stack in the chat, and I'll get to you. I don't mind being interrupted at all. If there's something that needs to be clarified, just stop me. So, as Frank Herbert once said, a beginning is a very delicate time. Know that it is 1831 in Berlin where Hegel is revising his magisterial Science of Logic. The beginning of philosophy hitherto, Hegel's time, has, like the sciences, begun arbitrarily with what cognition is in a subjectivity, like feeling, or ego, or sensation, or on the other hand, an objective content like the one, or the water, idea, substance, etc. However, neither the immediate nor the mediated is adequate for a beginning, so Hegel claims. So one reading the logic for the first time might be caught off guard by these words when they discover that the beginning of the logic consists of sheer being, an utterly immediate category. What is going on? Didn't Hegel just get done telling us it wouldn't be enough? In this section, Hegel sketches out the what and the why, though he warns us his sketch is merely an assurance without the full articulation. The entire philosophy as a whole is contained in being, though as it starts, it is but an abstract universal with nothing at all read into it. This has a couple of implications, which I'll get to presently. So Hegel begins by telling us why being, by situating it as the abstract universal of absolute knowing, the result from the phenomenology of spirit, in which Hegel proved that immediate, subject and object were one and the same in unity, though still differentiated as moments. Because the science of logic is chiefly concerned with the nature of cognition itself, it must be established in the science itself, rather than be defined beforehand. The concrete forms found in the phenomenology of spirit deal with consciousness realizing that absolute knowing is its own very same form in confronting what it took initially to be its other, its object. So seemingly, paradoxically, the science is to have no presuppositions whatsoever in its execution, but its initial beginning is very much presupposed by the progress in Hegel's earlier book. though the form of absolute knowing is reduced to its barest abstract, so that in truth, it is nothing but being. It's fully I'm going to make up a word here, but its fully contented form is mediated quite heavily by the forms of consciousness, but reduced to the abstract, it is empty. Philosophy itself at this stage is an empty word. Any preliminary words are assumed and thoroughly unjustified. Any talk of subjective or objective at this point are pretty pointless and meaningless. So at least within the logic. Pure knowing in this form has sublated all reference to an other and is without distinction. It ceases to be knowledge itself. And let me say that again. Being, or pure knowing like this ceases to be knowledge itself, okay? And it is present only as simple immediacy, in immediate, indeterminate being. No motion occurs within or without it, and it does not have an other, okay? For a moment, really quick, I'd like to talk about ground. Ground is what grounds the whole philosophy, conditions it in its many determinations. As we're reading it, the temptation will be to picture being as ground or the absolute idea as ground. The truth is more complicated than that. The completed knowledge and developed content is the ground of the knowledge. This seems a slippery way to put it, but no one simple category, either at beginning or end, quite captures the fullness of thought Hegel intends. It must be all of it, the developed universal, and well, all of it in the singular as well as the particular. The syllogism is highly implicated, though it is not developed yet at this stage, of course. This is just parenthetical. And we've already read through the smaller logic, which talks about the syllogism already. So we're fully aware of the contents in schematic form. But if you look at this, at this stage, the syllogism is highly implicated even in the structure of the logic because, for example, being, essence, and the idea / object each have their own character that sets them off from the other two books, as does the beginning itself, as does the result, which is itself a derivative of being as ground. I have a quote to read real quick. It's on page 71. Yeah, he says, we see that, that on the other hand, it is equally necessary to consider as result that into which the movement returns as into its ground. In this respect, the first is equally the ground and the last a derivative. Since the movement starts from the first and by correct inferences arrives at the last as the ground, this latter is a result. Further, the progress from that which forms the beginning is to be regarded as only a further determination of it. Hence, that which forms the starting point of the development remains at the base of all that follows and does not vanish from it. The progress does not consist merely in the derivation of an other or in the effected transition into a genuine other. And insofar as this transition does occur, it is equally sublated again. Thus, the beginning of philosophy is the foundation which is present and preserved throughout the entire subsequent development, remaining completely immanent in its further determinations. Okay, so when we open this book or we read this smaller logic, we have a list of categories that we're going through. But these categories as a list and something that you can sort of put your finger on for what thought is a lot more slippery than it looks, especially in light of this passage, I think, because Well, because of the fact, I mean, he says the progress does not consist merely in the derivation of another or in the affected transition into a genuine other. There's a lot more going on than simply moving from category to category, even logically. In the end, you know, the higher categories contain the lower ones. And so if effectively they, you know, when he says that they negate the lower categories, he's not lying. They disappear as immediate categories. In other words, if you were keeping a list of separate singular categories, technically it would be wrong. As odd as that sounds, that is exactly the case, because it would be a one-sided consideration. Even if you knew the whole of the logic, even if you knew the function of that category within its own development, the whole goal is to define the circle, the absolute. Okay. Let's see if I can finish off. This is where I stopped writing a script. So he goes over a lot of ground, but in the end, he says that the reason why the beginning is made with pure being is given in the science itself. Being is the content of pure knowing. The beginning demands immediacy. So the beginning, you know, the beginning is already predefined as absolute knowing, but because he empties it of content, we are able to make a science of it that doesn't rely on consciousness. And that's why we've got to start at the very abstract beginning to where it's practically nothing. It is nothing. It's just sitting there, being, and that's the end. Nothing further can be determined with this beginning. Philosophy is an empty word. Okay. Hegel rounds out the section talking about Fichte's unnamed ego as beginning. He doesn't name Fichte, but it's obvious that's what he's talking about. And the sciences, like chemistry, biology, which start from a general idea to do with the science, and he talks about the flaws involved in this. He says, you know, being as the beginning, the subject matter of the logic at this stage, to which others turn in other sciences, is still at this stage unknown. It's an uneasy but necessary state to be in. We don't actually know what the logic or what thought consists of scientifically yet at the beginning. Okay, and just to round up really quick, the section on the division of being, it doesn't actually say very much. All he comments on is the division written here is only preliminary. In other words, they're just signposts. And he talks about why quality precedes quantity logically, though the meaning of this is in the science. Hitherto, quantity came before quality. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking there and open up the stack. Thank you very much, comrades. Thanks, JR. JR asks, can you elaborate a little more on the piece of quality and quantity, specifically the science behind it?
I mean, we are going to go through the steps eventually.
I mean, not without reading out the logic just straight out of the book. I'm not sure where you're going.
I mean, I guess this is again from he does say historically it's always been quantity before quality. It's like you have a certain amount of objects and they each have a quality. But we find through the logic that quality shows up first. That's my, I guess, quick summary of it.
Yeah, Kant listed them quantity first, quality second, relation third, and modality fourth. And he did this basically copying it out of Aristotle as found knowledge, right? And just sort of dealing with it in his books in that way. But the problem with this is that let me see what he says. The beginning is made with being as such, therefore with qualitative being. It is easily seen from a comparison of quality with quantity that the former by nature is first. For quantity is quality which has already become negative. Magnitude is the determinateness which is no longer one with being, but is already differentiated from it. Sublated quality which has become indifferent. In other words, you've gone from what state you're in to how many of you there are, that kind of thing. It includes the alterableness of being, although the category itself, namely being, of which it is the determination, is not altered by it. So it's indifferent. The qualitative determinateness, on the other hand, is one with its being. It neither goes beyond it, nor is internal to it, but it is its immediate limitedness. Quality, therefore, as the immediate determinateness, is primary, and it is with it, with the beginning. It is with it that the beginning must be made. So there hasn't been a differentiation yet that you could count, right? And so quantity has to play second fiddle to just existing. And even my saying just existing is a shorthand, a bad one, because existence does not show up until the second book, I believe, Essence, in which, existence and non-existence are opposites related to each other, and thus part of what the categories of essence are made of, if I can say that. Hope that makes some sense. And JR is giving me the thumbs up. Wonderful. Okay. There isn't much to this section, but I feel like there's a lot talked about in terms of why a one-sided beginning begs the question of the other side, and the idea of the circle being implied in being makes it not just immediate, but also something with a lot more implications, but at the same time, its state, where it starts and where it keeps going in process, remains a presuppositionless process. There's a lot that mediates the beginning and a lot that mediates as you go along, but to stay imminent, you pretty much have to set your vector and go and not veer off. And half the logic is just him talking about why you shouldn't turn to port or starboard as you're going forward into the next transition. Little nautical reference there. All right, guys. Stacks open. Any comment? Anything at all? Nothing stupid. No bad questions. Trust me.
Jim is on stack.
Yes. Yeah. I just realized that. Jim, go ahead. Sorry. Wow.
Yeah, as you said before, the idea that quantity comes before quality, goes all the way back to Aristotle, and that idea is really pretty much basic in the natural sciences. Whenever a natural scientist comes, comes across, qualitative properties. The idea is to reduce the qualitative property to quantitative properties that can be, be measured precisely. And because when you talk about qualitative properties, it's much more difficult to be precise. And in philosophy, if you go like John Locke, distinguish between the primary properties of an object versus the secondary properties, and we talk about the primary properties. The emphasis is basically on the quantitative, whereas the secondary properties would be more on the qualitative side. So for Locke, quantity came first. And Hegel was upending that whole approach to things. And that has it's had some effect on subsequent philosophers, like I think Alfred North Whitehead and John Dewey. Both of them are influenced by Hegel, so they go along with Hegel on that point.
Thanks, Jim. That's actually very helpful. The difficulty these days with the ruling ideas centering scientifically around quantity, it's no wonder we all sort of stumble over qualitative categories, even just in our everyday life. But reading the logic, the entire first half that goes into the quality categories is notoriously difficult, even in Hegel's day. And because they're so difficult, they ended up, unfortunately, being the foundation right at the beginning of the misunderstandings and the twisting of Hegel's logic by people like Schelling and Heidegger, being in time, and Nietzsche, as well as Kierkegaard and a number of other people. Kyle, go ahead.
Well, that just kind of made me think of why I'm kind of how that kind of be thought backwards, because to a certain extent, first you're approaching something and it's a quality, but then as you're saying, you got to kind of discover the further truth about it, you determine a quantity out of it. Well, if you're thinking about it as instead of an unfolding truth, you think back to puncturing closer to the truth. I can see where you get it going backwards, because you think you're actually getting closer to the root rather than a truth that is evolving.
Stack is open. Yeah, the more I read this, the more ephemeral it seems to become, because I don't know, it's hard to describe exactly, but one can look at the entire progression after finishing the book and realize that this is the absolute in its entire content, but it's almost read backwards. But you can't know that was the result, or at least you as the reader and the philosopher is not allowed, as Hegel says, to presuppose anything, even leave open the possibility. And this is a point that Hulgate and Dieter Henrich get to in their books, which is that leaving open the possibility that it could just fail, because within the logic, especially the parts where he talks about previous philosophy, he actually gives the history of a crash landing of philosophy, where Fichte burned out, where Jacobi burned out, where Spinoza supposedly burned out in their systems or their expositions. And so Hegel, in writing and sort of thinking this stuff through, was, I think, perfectly open to the idea that he would hit dead ends. He probably hit dead ends before finally settling on this. Stacks open. And it is 9:28. We're doing good. If we run out of stuff to talk about, honestly, I could just read out the first 3 entries and stop right at the discussion part, and then we could start talking about the discussions next time if we want, or we could keep talking about the beginning. It's a hard thing, you know, when we think about concrete things in our thoughts and we come across this writing and we realize that the beginning that Hegel is talking about is, it implicates the entire system, and yet it has to be so empty in order to be a beginning. And that's the nature of a beginning, that kind of thing. Boulgate spends an awful lot of time in his book, The Opening of Hegel's Logic, talking about how you're supposed to look at the beginning, how you're supposed to proceed presuppositionlessly. Doug, you're muted. Are you trying to talk? Okay.
No, I was waiting for you to finish.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I just
If
saw
you're
that.
still talking, please keep going.
No, I was just trying to. Yeah, go ahead. You're fine.
I was just thinking, you know, I'm a trained historian, not a trained philosopher. And I remember when I was an undergraduate and everyone in our historiography class had to decide our topic, like that we were going to research. And I remember everyone pretty much had like very specific niche that they were going to do. Like I was doing something on Northern Ireland or the occupied 6 counties. There's one kid in the class. I shouldn't say he was a kid because he's older than me. And he said, oh, I want to do the foundations of Western civilization, which, you know, for a historiography class where you're just essentially gathering sources and then writing a 10 to 20 page paper, that is an enormously overly ambitious topic. And he eventually came back to the class and said, I realized like I didn't know where to start once he kind of did that. Because, I mean, approaching history is not just names and dates, although those are important. And it's, you know, but it's like, what's the reason behind it? You know, what's the cause and effect? And where do you start? And obviously, you know, trying to have your method, you know, and doing something on like a scale of like what is like Western civilization is kind of nuts. But on the other hand, it's like you do need a system, I think. You know, being a history buff is one thing because anyone can rattle off names and dates of all kinds of stuff. And you see those kind of people who can give you all kinds of specs on like tanks or weapons or stuff. And they tend to actually have like really crappy politics and understanding of actual historical processes. You know, if you ever encounter them, especially like World War II or the Civil War. You know, but that's a digression I won't get into here. But the beginning, it's so important because like, where do you start? Where do you elaborate a system? Because you need a system, I think, to understand history. And if you look at like the great historians going all the way back to the Greeks, you know, they are trying to develop their system. And they look at like, you know, is this a divine plan? The hubris of man being struck down by the gods and everything. And they're trying to work within that system to understand history. And, you know, obviously by the time we're getting to the Enlightenment with rationalism, with Spinoza, Hegel, Descartes, all of them, we're starting to put all of that nonsense about, you know, divine plan to the side, but we still need to find, you know, reason in history, what is causing history, what's the motor. And obviously for Marx, this is the class struggle and all of that. But beginning, you know, Hegel, he spends so much time just kind of, you know, in the shorter logic, kind of thinking about like, where do you start? And this is obviously was a concern for Marx when he wrote Capital, which, from a political economic standpoint, that's like his logic. And I mean, at the beginning, I feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but it's being, and obviously, being and nothing and everything, not in the Sartrean sense, and just kind of looking like how the categories develop, how the contradictions move. And, it's obviously incredibly dense. Like I have a lot of trouble understanding it, probably as much as anyone here. But just thinking about beginnings, because if you have the correct beginning, you can develop the system and you can understand, like, if you were to, now I'm tying it all the way back to my anecdote at the beginning, is if you actually have like the correct approach, if you understand where to start, then you could actually approach a question like, well, where does the foundations of Western civilization come from? Or where do we start when we analyze capitalism? And it's really worth, I think, after thinking, reading Hegel or alongside it, it's worth going back to Marx's introduction to the Grundrisse, where he actually talks about like the various false starts. And you can kind of see like how this Hegelian thinking relates to that. And I think it's important to deal with this on an abstract level, because you do need to get rid of all the contingencies and everything, all the stuff that's kind of getting in the way to get to what is truly essential, truly what is necessary, what is determined, and all of that. Otherwise, you're going to go down all these false paths and rabbit holes. And Hegel does that. Marx does that when he starts with the commodity, and from there develops his approach to capitalism in all its manifold dialectical contradictions. And Hegel does the same thing. And it's such a hard, it's like a cliche at this point when you say, like, you have to free your mind, like Neo, Morpheus to Neo in the Matrix. Because if you're coming in the beginning with like, oh, it has to go to this path because of my presupposition about Christianity, or something that's already like determined where it goes, well, no, then you're going to go down a false path. And I don't know if I'm making sense. I've been up since like 3 a.m, but just some thoughts, and feel free to tell me I'm completely wrong. So.
Thanks, Doug. One of the things I reflect on what you said, like it's harder. It seems Marx almost has the harder job, because he's dealing with concrete reality, and he has a whole bunch of variables he has to sort through. And where do you start? Capital? Do you start with money? He actually documented where he tried to start at those various places and came to a halt, because the next logical step turned out to be behind him, right, or far in the distance, instead of the next transition. And with thought, it almost seems to me Hegel had an easier job of it after having written the Phenomenology of Spirit, where he left off was absolute knowing, and all he really had to do was abstract that already developed state of consciousness to its bare bones, and say, this is the most abstract version of thought. And because it is already absolute knowing, the gamble was, and it turned out to be right, at least in his writing, that it would end up as the absolute idea in a complete circle, because and think about this, think about it functionally rather than just sort of as a static category. The absolute idea is exactly what is able to functionally, in a singular person, abstract something like sheer being. You couldn't get that abstraction out of a rock, or a dog or a cat, so Hegel claims. This is about human thought, and where human thought is, and what generates human thought. And that's part of what closes the circle, is that the thinking human being can generate that abstraction. and then think through what that abstraction actually entails, and then we go from one to another, and that's kind of what generates the circle in its full articulation. So yeah, it's going to take a while, but I'm thoroughly invested in the idea that I'm going to have to stop thinking of the logic or of nature or of spirit itself as a list of features, which is, how I'm sort of built by bourgeois society to look at it, and instead look at it as the closed circle, whose beginning and end is itself, right? And the only difference is a matter of abstraction. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And we are at 9:39. Stack is open. I was going to say something about the haunt. One of the things, I'm finally getting around to reading de Hondt's book, the only one translated, on Hegel. And one of the topics he touches on very, very briefly is the state of Protestantism in Germany at the time that Hegel was living there. And Hegel's conception of what Protestantism consisted of at the time versus Catholicism is wildly different from what I grew up with as Protestantism, or any of the mainline churches today. It's, okay, so let me just read this out, because so he says, perhaps at this period of his life in particular, Hegel seemed to attach himself to Protestantism as an antidote to Catholicism. Now, when we talk to certain folks, and they say, well, Hegel is sort of caught up in the religious fervor, and he talks about God, and so this is a bourgeois thing, and it needs to be swept aside. Well, they're reading modern religion into this period, which is, I think, very wrong-headed. I'll keep going. Discreetly in public, more openly in private, Hegel always presented it under its least sectarian and most liberal aspect, a religion of freedom. On this point, he remained true to the ideas he had expressed to Niethammer as early as 1810. Protestantism does not so much consist in any special creed as in the spirit of reflection and higher rational education, not in the spirit of drill serving this or that utilitarian purpose. He reaffirmed this opinion in 1816. Protestantism is not entrusted to the hierarchical organization of a church, but lies solely in general insight and culture. Our universities and schools are our church. You think about that for a second. Every time he brings up God, in light of especially this passage, it throws a whole new light on the whole situation. Accusing him of mysticism by bringing up God very much shows how poorly people are read on the history of the period. At least I think it is. Stack is open.
I was gonna say right quick, I did like the sections, like, for all the people who think I should just start it at the beginning and not deal with it. Okay, cool. So you agree with me. Let's start at the beginning.
Yeah, he's a very provocative writer within the text. He's constantly daring his critics to come at him with their critiques. Of course, none of his critics actually do so. Instead, they sort of go behind his back and try to misrepresent what he said, especially after his death. They completely redefine what he said to where he's like a Neoplatonist and all kinds of other things. You know, he's a partisan of the Prussian state, which he was against the Restoration, lock, stock, and barrel, at a time when very few would openly say anything close to that. You know, this is after the defeat of Napoleon and the whole consolidation period. And, you know, he even wrote in one particular secret letter that was in the closed post, the closed letter carriers at the time, to a friend, talking about this. It's in the Dahant, but okay, so it's 9:40. Did you guys just hear me talk about him being against the Restoration, or had I already muted?
You had already muted.
Okay, well, I just said a whole bunch of stuff without talking. Crap. Oh well, no, that's okay. So it's 9:45, and we've been talking very abstractly about the beginning, and
You just muted yourself for like 10, 15 seconds. Sorry.
oh, okay, okay, good. So
Yeah, we heard it all.
so thanks for that. That helps. Okay. So we can talk about the beginning of section 1 next time, but I want to kind of wanted to kind of put meat on the bones of what we've just been talking about, because talking about the beginning in the abstract is a very meta conversation. And so I'm just going to read this out since it's very short. It is very short, the opening, and I'm just going to read it out on my own if that's okay with you guys. For the last 15 minutes, maybe we could talk about it a little and then
Jim's on stack.
round it out. Thank you. Sorry, I shouldn't chair today because I have tunnel vision. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, what's the thing about when you're discussing Hegel's politics? The thing that you have to keep in mind was, he was a professor at the University of Berlin. Therefore, he was a civil servant, and therefore subordinate to the Prussian state. So he had to parse his words pretty carefully. But I think it's apparent that he was, when he did talk about the Prussian state, he always emphasized the idea that it was a constitutional monarchy. And he was basically, I think, implying that he was hoping that the parliamentary institutions would eventually gain the upper hand in Prussia. You couldn't say it. You couldn't go too far in saying that, because he was supposed to be a loyal subject of the king. But but I think it's evident that he wanted to see it become if not a republic, or no, certainly a parliamentary state like England, at the very least. And some of that also applies when he talks about religion too. He always presented himself as a devout and loyal Lutheran Christian. That when you look at it, what his writings about, he takes all up words, including very basic words like God, and redefines them in ways that would be quite strange to ordinary believers if they had actually bothered to read them. And as you know, some critics accuse him of being a covert atheist. And this is And they were not necessarily wrong about that either.
That's very true. So like I said, I was gonna real quick read through some of this unless someone wanted to get on stack and keep going on the beginning. I mean, we're still talking about the beginning. Good. Okay, this is going to be really quick, but when he talks about abstracting from absolute knowing and its full implication, so he gives us this. So it's being pure being without any further determination. In its indeterminate immediacy, it is equal only to itself. It is also not unequal relatively to an other. It has no diversity within itself, nor any with a reference outwards. It would not be held fast in its purity if it contained any determination or content which could be distinguished in it, or by which it could be distinguished from an other. It is pure indeterminateness and emptiness. There is nothing to be intuited in it, if one could speak here of intuiting, or it is only this pure intuiting itself. Just as little as anything to be thought in it, or it is equally only this empty thinking. Being the indeterminate immediate is in fact nothing, and neither more nor less than nothing. Okay. Nothing, pure nothing. It is simply equality with itself, complete emptiness, absence of all determination and contents, undifferentiatedness in itself. Insofar as intuiting or thinking can be mentioned here, it counts as a distinction whether something or nothing is intuited or thought. To intuit or think nothing has therefore a meaning. Both are distinguished, and thus nothing exists in our intuiting or thinking, or rather it is empty intuition and thought itself, and the same empty intuition or thought as pure being. Nothing is therefore the same determination, or rather absence of determination, and thus altogether the same as pure being. And just really quick, becoming, the unity of being and nothing. Pure being and pure nothing are therefore the same. What is the truth is neither being nor nothing, but that being does not pass over, but has passed over into nothing, and nothing into being. But it is equally true that they are not undistinguished from each other, that on the contrary, they are not the same, that they are absolutely distinct, and yet that they are unseparated and inseparable, and that each immediately vanishes in its opposite. Their truth is therefore this movement of the immediate vanishing of the one in the other, becoming, which is the category, which is a movement in which both are distinguished, but by a difference which has equally immediately resolved itself. Okay, and that's the opening, that's the beginning. And you notice immediately that other than the quick descriptors like being, pure being without any further determination, a lot of the rest of the first entry, being, if you've already read the small logic, you can see how much it written in here references the shapes of essence and object already, although you're not supposed to know that. That's just Hegel sort of mapping it out for you. So it's not so he talks about how there's no diversity within itself, nor any with a reference outwards, right? Reference outwards from one of these categories of being, of thought, is a reference to the doctrine of essence. But here we are all the way at the beginning. And so it, even in the logical statements in the science of logic already from the first, he's already got a parallel argument running, one that is logical and immanent, and the other that's almost commentary like, but at the same time, he has to make sure that the commentary does not taint the logical argument itself. And I mean, even with nothing, he cannot get a sentence into nothing without already paralleling what being is. Simple equality with itself, you know, A equals A, identity, right off the bat. And the fact that pure being and pure nothing are the same and yet different, you know, you've already got this dialectical shape appearing. I'm going to stop there, and Stack is open, but I wanted to kind of put some meat on the bones of that beginning, just to sort of give us a taste. We'll talk about it next time in full, definitely. But we have about 6 minutes until time. Stack's open. It's such an abstract concept that you almost don't expect there to be any movement at all. And then when you start to see the different being differentiate itself with nothing, or rather pass over into it, having already passed over into it, being what it is, right? You know, then that movement just sort of generates itself based on what sheer being is. And so what should come to a full stop, being so abstract, doesn't actually do that. And I think Hegel knows that was going to be the case, because the actual content of the absolute idea, it's not that he already had it in mind necessarily. It's just that one cannot make a science of the science of consciousness. What am I trying to say? The science of consciousness and the science of thought are not the same thing, right? But the scientific mind that consciousness finds itself to be in the phenomenology, right, cannot make a science of its absolute knowing until it's, you know, without enumerating itself logically, which is what we're doing here. Empty it of all content and start going through scientifically. Stack is open. Any comments? Just gee whiz, how you're finding this so far for the last 3 or 4 minutes?
Yeah, I feel like it's setting me up for kind of where we're going again, except in more detail.
Agreed. At the same time, I feel like it's an entirely new book, even having read this 2 or 3 times already, even this section. I'm finding some of his distinctions, some of his explanations of the history of philosophy and why he is going this direction to be so much more enlightening than I had before. Hoolgate gets you a great deal of the way there, but there are parts of it that Hegel, once you get it, actually explains further to you than Hoolgate. And I think Hoolgate knows that. Hoolgate has his project. He wants to get people started on reading and understanding, kind of where to make a beginning, because Hegel is going to take you the rest of the way. He's actually really forthcoming on what he wants you to know. The thing is, it's not even that you have to speak the lingo. It's just that you have to be oriented on the path and be willing to take that rugged mountain trail that's not a royal road, but rather something along the lines. If anyone here has read The Lord of the Rings, when they go into the Emyn Muil, which is this rocky, this long, miles long stretch of rocky, craggy ground. It sort of reminds me of that. JR says he's been enjoying listening in. It's wonderful. Glad you rewatched the video. Anyone watching, you can go back and watch from the beginning if you like, and join us at any time. Just hit me up on my Facebook or even on the group page, and just let me know, and I'll send you the link, and you can actually come and participate with us. No problem. Be glad to have you. So we're coming up on a minute, and this has been great. Any final words or hopes for where we're going?
I might pick up that Python-based 3D spiral thing again.
Especially with this last section, and this is my last thought, but the character of the spiral and how the moments repeat themselves as you go up really kind of comes home for me when he talks about the beginning actually being conditioned by the end, and the result is as a derivative returns to the beginning, and it being a full circle instead of just a straight line path. And that's and that the fact that then it hooks up into the next circle and externalizes into nature. If you really think about it, being is an abstract category. At the end, getting to the absolute idea and returning to being has turned from a 2D object into a 3D object in nature, as opposed to where it started, which is just sort of this abstract thought about being, right? And with that, I'll bid the audience goodbye, and thank you very much, comrades.